And thank you for joining me here. I'm Don Ma. So a lot has happened this week so far. We could be facing a government shutdown, a potential strike by the United Auto Workers Union. So to start off today's show, here's a quick look at some of the headwinds facing the U.S. economy right now.
The U.S. economy is facing a couple of major hurdles, including another possible shutdown of the federal government next month.
Both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, have put us in this place where we have extraordinarily high inflation, where we're going to add $18.8 trillion to the debt in the next 10 years.
The United Auto Workers Union could announce a strike on Friday.
Since inflation is off the chart, it's not beneficial to me to be working at Ford, making half of what other people are making or not receiving the benefits that they're making.
And oil prices, which affect the cost of gas prices, are forecast to stay up through the end of the year. However,
people are out there with a lot discretionary consumer spending, travel, hotels, restaurants, all of that is booming. So people are acting as if they're in good shape financially, and yet they say, wow, this is a disastrous economy.
The Federal Reserve will announce whether or not another interest rate hike is on the way during their meeting next week. According to the CME Group's FedWatch tool, financial markets believe there's more than a 90% chance the Fed will vote to hold interest rates steady. But only about half feel the same about another pause in November.
And the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director is pushing the broad use of updated COVID-19 vaccines. And this is as the country prepares to start a vaccination campaign within days. Here's more.
The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has urged a broad use of updated COVID-19 shots as the country prepares to start a vaccination campaign within days. The decision covers everybody ages 6 months and up. CDC Director Mandy Cohen signed off the decision on Tuesday after top advisors in the agency met and voted 13-1, recommending shots by Pfizer, BioNTech SE, and Moderna. The shots target the new XBB.1.5 variant, which is the dominant COVID strain in the U.S. The broad use of COVID vaccines in the U.S. differs from what European countries have been doing, which is prioritizing the elderly and selected groups. The CDC said simply recommending the vaccine for everybody outweighed complications created by tailoring recommendations more precisely.
And some bad news for the economy. A new government report shows family incomes are falling. They dropped for the third year in a row last year. The Census Bureau found the average family income in 2022 was $74,580. That's a 2.3% drop from 2021. Analysts say rising prices are likely to blame. Inflation hit a 40-year high last summer. And a crisis not seen in over 9 decades is sweeping New York City. A surge of illegal immigrants has strained the city's homeless shelters, making up half of this population. Here's more.
New York City is facing a level of homelessness not seen since the Great Depression in the 1930s. That's according to the Coalition for the Homeless, a not-for-profit. As of mid-August, there were more than 110,000 people sleeping in the city's shelter system each night. And that number doesn't include the thousands of unsheltered people who sleep on the streets. Compounding the chronic problem is an influx of asylum seekers, who now make up more than half the sheltered population. Juan de la Cruz at the Coalition for the Homeless sees the impact firsthand.
For example, here at St. Bartholomew's Church, where we start serving, we were seeing on average anywhere from 250 to 275 people, more or less regularly. Once the new arrivals started coming, our numbers got up over 400 people.
It's not gone unnoticed by the city's unsheltered population.
Although I have to wait and go through all these channels, and they picking up busloads of people from other places, bringing them up and giving them space. Why can't we get first dibs?
New York State has been bound by a decades-old consent decree from a class action lawsuit to provide shelter to people without homes. That mandate has become a point of contention between the city and the state.
Now we're getting people from all over the globe.
Mayor Eric Adams says the city is running out of money, space, and personnel.
I don't see an ending to this. This issue will destroy New York City. Destroy New York City. We're getting 1,000 migrants a month. And everyone is saying it's New York City's problem.
Adams has called for more support, including a way to expedite pathways to work authorization, a barrier that surprises some new arrivals, says Jeffrey Newman, founder of Backpacks for the Street, a nonprofit.
And I think that we don't have, there's no infrastructure here to allow people to figure out how they move through that process and what that process is. And the same thing for the people who are homeless already and existing here. There is no sort of, it's a broken system.
And where Mayor Adams sees no end in sight to the migrant influx, Philip Llanos from John Jay College at the City University of New York isn't so sure. He separates the more recent problem around new arrivals from the chronic issue of homelessness.
I think that the crisis around asylum seekers will pass. And of course, there are federal responses that need to be made, and I don't think this is going to stay on like this. But the issue of chronic homelessness among single adults and families will continue in New York City as it continues to become less and less affordable.
$10 billion or more, that's the amount projected to be spent on ads in the 2024 election cycle. A company called Ad Impact monitors political ad spending. They expect spending to surpass $10 billion in races for the White House, Congress, and gubernatorial elections. The company says it's a 13% increase over the 2019-2020 election cycle. It attributes the increase to factors like Republicans trying to keep a House majority and Democrats trying to keep Senate control. Now, abortion-related issues were also cited as a contributing factor. And the United Auto Workers Union is threatening to strike against Detroit's big three automakers. UAW members say they'll walk out if an agreement is not reached on a new contract. NTD's Andrew Thomas has the latest.
Workers on these Ford assembly lines in Detroit and Kansas City are looking for a better deal. They're among the 150,000 members of the United Auto Workers Union working for Ford, GM, and Stellantis. NYU Business School professor Joseph Foudy explained the union's strategy.
They're actually choosing to negotiate simultaneously with all three major automakers, whereas usually they would just sort of pick one and use that as a pattern. So how it plays out in the next couple of days is unusually uncertain.
The group of automakers is also known as Detroit's Big Three. So far, they haven't been able to reach an agreement with the union. Executive analyst of iSeeCars.com, Carl Brower, says the two are at an impasse.
It's really unfortunate because we see a big disparity between what the UAW wants and what the automakers are prepared to pay, which seems like it's unavoidable that we're going to end up in a strike situation.
Foudy says the union has made some pretty big requirements for a potential deal.
The unions have made really, really extensive demands. 46% pay increase, 32-hour work week, kind of an end to kind of the two-tier system where older workers got more benefits and newer ones got less, more spending on healthcare spending for retirees.
But Ford and GM have conditions of their own, and they're not even close to what the UAW is demanding.
Companies like Ford and GM are only offering a 9 or 10% pay increase, which, if you think about recent inflation, is not that much, with some lump sum side payments. So each side is really, at least as a starting position, very far away.
Brower says a strike could lead to higher car prices. The walkout could also mean larger ramifications for the industry, consumers, and the overall economy.
If it goes for a longer period of time, it could really start to hurt U.S. automakers' market share. People will start to buy other cars because they can't buy U.S. cars. And it will really start to hurt those local economies and the larger U.S. economy if it's an extended strike.
Negotiations over a new deal began in July, but the three automakers have made little headway on the terms of the contract. The current contract expires at midnight Eastern Time on Friday. Andrew Thomas, NTD News.
Thursday at 11:59 p.m. That's the deadline to avoid a possible strike if an agreement is not reached between the UAW and the car makers. Union workers say they're prepared to walk off the assembly line this Friday. So here's a possible look at what could that mean for car buyers.
If you're in the market for a new car with the United Auto Workers strike looming, one question you may be asking is this the right time to buy? GM, Ford, and Stellantis automakers are the big three that may be affected. A strike against all three companies could be a more than $5 billion hit to the economy after just 10 days, according to an estimate from the Anderson Economic Group.
I am sort of urging a measure of caution with respect to panicking about this situation. We need to see what happens. We need to see whether there could be a last-minute deal.
Mark Hamrick from Bankrate says if a strike does happen, there are two questions to consider. Which automakers are affected and how long will the shutdown last?
I think there's going to be an ample supply of vehicles for at least a number of weeks, if indeed a strike or sort of the worst possible outcome does present itself.
Industry analysts say it comes down to inventory. It just depends on what you're buying.
There's still a shortage in the most popular models, and those are the people and places that we're really going to feel it the most.
Pat Ryan, the CEO of Copilot, says while some models have longer wait times, if you're willing to be flexible, you will have options.
In certain brands, like the Stellantis brands, you know, the Dodges, the Jeeps, and the Ram trucks, there's plenty of supply.
If you are picky about your make and model, Ryan's advice is to either buy now or wait until the strike is over.
We've continued to see the car market be very, very strong, both new and used, in spite of the incredible increase in prices, both nominally and the even higher increase in monthly payments.
Meanwhile, the air traffic controller shortage that has been blamed for several recent travel disruptions isn't going away anytime soon, it seems like. Not next year, not the year after that. According to the trade association Airlines for America, it's going to take at least 5 to 7 years. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg says the U.S. is currently short about 3,000 controllers. Airlines for America calculates even if the Federal Aviation Administration hires everyone who goes through its academy, we're still going to be short for years. That one academy is the only way to get certified in the U.S., which the group says is a huge problem. It's suggesting allowing universities with air traffic controller programs to offer certification courses. Airlines are also planning to ask the FAA to cut back the number of flights at New York area airports. That region is where air traffic controller understaffing is at its worst. Meanwhile, shares in Pratt Whitney parent RTX Corp hit a 2-year low on Monday as it took a $3 billion charge and told airlines hundreds of their Airbus jets could be grounded in the coming years. Here's more.
Airlines could face chaos over a flaw found in some jet engines. US maker Pratt & Whitney says it's found a risk of cracks in its geared turbofans. They're fitted to hundreds of planes made by Airbus. Up to 700 engines may now have to be pulled off the A320neo aircraft for checks. And repairs could be a slow process, up to 300 days per engine. That's according to Pratt parent firm RTX Corp, until recently known as Raytheon. Overall, it says up to 650 planes could be stuck on the ground during the first half of next year. Shares in the firm sank to 2-year lows on Monday after the news was revealed. Airlines around the world are now assessing their options. Analysts say Spirit, JetBlue and Hawaiian face the biggest problems among US carriers. Germany's Lufthansa says it's conducting an evaluation. Hungary-based budget airline Wizz says its capacity could be cut by 10% over the problem. And on Tuesday, Air New Zealand said it would face a significant impact. RTX says its profits will take a hit of up to $3.5 billion over the issue, which won't be fully resolved until 2026.
The landmark Google trial opens with sweeping accusations of illegal monopolization. The case has been described as one of the largest U.S. antitrust trials. NTT's Daniel Monahan has the latest.
Tuesday was day one of a multi-week trial, and it kicked off with explosive opening remarks from U.S. prosecutors who say this case is about the future of the Internet. They accuse Google of operating an illegal monopoly to promote their own search engine, stifling competition, and thereby harming every computer and mobile device user in the United States. A Department of Justice lawyer said Google pays more than $10 billion a year to Apple and other companies to ensure that Google is the default or only search engine on browsers and devices. And with more users come more user data, which the DOJ argues then feeds back into Google's dominance in other areas like online advertising. Google maintains their business practices are lawful and argued that their search engine is the preferred option for many. The company's president of global affairs said people don't use Google because they have to, they use it because they want to. The trial is expected to feature witness testimony from Google's CEO as well as other senior executives and former employees from Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Samsung. If Google loses, possible ramifications could include a breakup of the business or a significant change in Google's business practices relating to their search engine. And given it accounted for more than half of parent company Alphabet's annual revenue last year, that could have a significant impact. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
And of course, it's Apple season. The tech giant held a major product event to kick off the sprint to the holiday season, and the iPhone 15 was front and center. Here's a look at the details and how it stacks up against the competition.
We're excited to talk about how we're taking Apple Watch and iPhone even further.
Apple's iPhone 15 unveiled Tuesday with new features and a new look, updates to the display, the camera, and more.
Our amazing community of developers have made the dynamic island even more useful by expanding what it can do. Now you can track a pizza delivery and follow the big game at the same time.
The announcement comes as Apple prepares for the annual sprint to the holidays and consumers get more particular about upgrading their smartphones. CNET's Bridget Carey says she's covered 13 iPhone launch events since joining the outlet. She says smaller smartphone upgrades, things not as visible to the eye as a new color or bold display, have become a tougher sell.
As I'm talking to people all the time, it is, well, I can still keep my phone. It's 4 years old. I could just replace the battery instead of buying a whole new one.
Apple also announced USB-C charging for its smartphones for the first time. It's a change that could help consumers ultimately streamline necessary charging devices across gadgets and brands, and one that may have been influenced by policy abroad.
Apple may have had its hand forced a little bit because of regulations from the European Union, which says any mobile device is going to need to be using a USB-C charger so that consumers could just have one charger for everything and there could be less environmental waste.
And amid reports that China could be banning the iPhone, new reports are showing that China, in fact, has not issued a ban on the purchase and use of foreign phone brands. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said on Wednesday in response to media reports that some government agencies and firms had told staff to stop using Apple's iPhones at work. Here are the reports.
China says it has not banned iPhones. A flurry of recent media reports said government staff had been forbidden from using the Apple products. The measures reportedly also hit state-owned firms. But on Wednesday, officials in Beijing said there was no such ban. The Foreign Ministry said there were no laws, regulations or policy documents prohibiting the use of handsets made by Apple or other foreign firms. However, a spokesperson said the government had noticed a lot of reports concerning security incidents related to iPhones. The supposed ban coincided with rising tensions between Washington and Beijing, and it sent Apple's stock sharply lower, as China is a key market for its products. Shares in the Silicon Valley giant dropped more than 6% over 2 days last week, wiping $190 billion off its market value. China has increasingly urged the use of locally made gear, with tech now a regular focus of disputes with the US.
Mother Nature has wreaked havoc throughout the summer with devastating financial impact. It may be a good time to ask, are your finances prepared to weather a natural disaster? Here's some tips on how to stay prepared financially.
Mother Nature has been punishing this summer, and hurricane season could bring more chaos before it wraps up. The National Hurricane Center says it's important to think a few steps ahead.
Often people, when they evacuate out of a hurricane zone, they underestimate how long it might take to safely get back into the community that they've evacuated from.
And in the stressful run-up to a natural disaster like a hurricane or wildfire, basic needs like food, shelter, and water take priority, which is why experts recommend having a disaster readiness financial plan at the ready year-round. To do that, FEMA recommends the following steps. First, gather your important financial documents and contacts. For documents that are paper only, take a photo and keep some cash in a safe place in case ATMs or banks are inaccessible. Review your insurance policies to be sure that they are current and know the range of disasters for which they'll support you. FEMA also suggests safeguarding paper and electronic copies of all files in safe locations and updating items anytime there's a big life change like a move, a job switch, or the birth of a child. If households update a plan periodically, it's one less thing to think about when emergency is imminent, information flow is rapid, and decisions need to be made quickly.
Just focus on the information that is pertinent to you, your area, and that is actionable.
And although it's too soon to declare a victory over inflation, many economic analysts believe things are heading in the right direction and that the Federal Reserve may hold interest rates steady next month. Take a look.
The average U.S. family spent about $700 more in July compared to 2 years ago to buy the same goods and services, according to Moody's Analytics.
Look at how much parents are paying for materials for children, back to school materials. Prices have gone up. Maybe the rate of increase may slow, but the level has gone up significantly.
The main cause for consumers forking out more money is still high inflation. In an attempt to curb these rising prices, the Federal Reserve boosted U.S. interest rates 11 times since March 2022.
It's no fun. No one likes it, but if you're going to get inflation back in the bottle, this is part of the process. Good news is inflation is getting back in the bottle.
The CME FedWatch tool says the financial markets believe there's nearly a 90% chance the central bank will hold rates steady in September.
We have a kind of a Goldilocks economic situation where economic growth is slowing without going into a recession.
Another reason for economic optimism, wages are starting to outpace inflation.
Things feel like they're moving in the right direction. Hopefully, 6-12 months down the road, the Fed can start taking its foot off the brakes and lowering those interest rates, and the banking system will feel a lot better as a result.
And finally, U.S. consumer prices increased by the most in more than a year in August. The consumer price index increased by 0.6% last month. Now, this is the largest gain since June of 2022. So year over year, the CPI jumped 3.7%, which is also higher than July. Some economists believe inflation risks are leaning to the upside potentially. This is because of rising insurance costs, especially for motor vehicles. A strike in the automotive sector could also disrupt supply chains and boost motor vehicle prices if it lasted more than a month. And here with me to talk about the CPI report is Sam Burns, Chief Strategist at Mill Street Research. So good morning, Sam. Today's CPI report, definitely not something to celebrate. Gasoline or energy prices contributed the most to the uptick. Any worries in your mind that this inflation battle could last longer than we think?
Well, I think, the Fed is certainly going to be hesitant to declare victory on inflation anytime soon. So I think they'll keep up a certain amount of hawkish messaging. But I think the overall trend in inflation, and certainly the things that the Fed has any control over, are still in kind of a downward overall trend, even though there's a lot of noise in the data. So I think the structural trend is still there, but it does kind of complicate the Fed's messaging a little bit.
So the uptick this month and last month as well. So these past 2 months, there's not really much there to talk about?
Overall, no. I think this month was mostly due to energy prices and even flowing through to things like airfares, which are directly, closely tied to energy costs. And those are things that the Fed typically doesn't think that are worth changing policy for, meaning that they can't affect OPEC. And really, OPEC is the reason why oil prices are up and why fuel costs and airfares and things like that are being influenced, because they've restricted supply, and that's really a political decision based on what OPEC is doing. It's not anything that the domestic U.S. monetary policy can really affect. I think a lot of the more domestic things based on consumer spending here and things like that are still in the kind of a disinflationary trend. Most goods prices are still falling or flat. And I think the housing costs are going to be going down, slowing, I guess, over the next, say, 6 months. as kind of the CPI catches up with what we know about rents. So I think those factors will continue to be downward pressures, and the energy costs will be sort of a variable, but it's not something the Fed can directly control.
I see. I see. So you're still convinced that the trajectory for inflation is still downward.
That's right. I think the general trend is still disinflationary. I think the growth in labor income is still positive but slowing. Bank credit has slowed quite a bit. So a lot of the domestic factors that tend to drive inflation are still pulling back. And because we know about the lags in the housing market data, we know that housing costs and rents have slowed quite a bit already, and the data will be reflecting that. So a lot of the things that are harder to measure, like education or healthcare, financial services, those tend to be where a lot of the noise comes from in the inflation data. But I think that the longer term trends there are, again, kind of moving in the right direction overall.
Speaking of the lag in rents, I would have thought, it would have shown up by now, but it seems like it's taking longer than I think.
That's right. It has been a little bit of a bumpy ride. I mean, the rate of change of rents in terms of the owner's equivalent rent and the rental costs that they use in the CPI have turned down, but they're still much higher than actual rental changes on a kind of a more real-time basis are. And so because they have roughly a 12-month lag historically, because if you think of somebody signing a 12-month lease typically on a rental housing unit, that's kind of the lag that's embedded in it in many ways. So it will take 6 to 12 months for the CPI data to catch up to what sort of current market rents are, and that's what we're seeing now. So that's why I think over the next, say, 3 to 6 months, we'll see more of that, because we know that the current rents are not growing as fast as what the CPI says right now.
So how is the Federal Reserve looking at this report? Does this report change anything?
I doubt it changes anything major. I think that they're still going to hold rates steady at their meeting this month. The market is kind of pricing in some chance that they do a November or December rate hike. My guess is that they'll probably find a reason to avoid that, but they'll keep their messaging on the hawkish side. So I think they'll kind of talk about staying tight more than they'll actually act. I think they realize they've already done a lot of tightening and that rates are already quite high, and that as reported inflation continues to kind of ease, then their policy rates will still look high relative to reported inflation. So I think they've realized they've done quite a bit already. They don't really need to do more, and there's not much they can do about things like OPEC and oil prices, and so that they'll try to avoid responding to fluctuations in oil prices and things like that. So that's why I think they'll probably try to keep it steady if at all possible.
Just a side comment here. You know what I found interesting is so Jerome Powell spoke at the Jackson Hole summit recently. He said that inflation is partially caused by the war in Ukraine, but I noticed that he didn't mention the trillions of dollars of stimulus injected into the economy. And what's funny is that, Sam, if you think about what Russia's war in Ukraine impacts, it impacts energy prices, right? And that's the thing that the Fed doesn't look at. So how can you say that the war in Ukraine is a bigger factor than to inflation than the liquidity injection? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, no, I think it's true that both have had a big impact. And I think it was more that in the first half or so of 2022, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a huge spike in oil and natural gas, but also things like wheat, where the production from Ukraine and Russia was interrupted. So I think there was a big sort of sudden spike in inflation that was caused in part by Russia invading Ukraine, and that has now since faded. So I think it was more of a historical comment saying that there was a big impact from it, but it is now kind of eased because outside of what OPEC has been doing, oil prices have come back down a lot, natural gas prices have come back down, and a lot of the food prices, commodity prices have come back down as well. So the stimulus, I think, is a bigger picture, longer term driver. And so I think to the extent that they refer to fiscal policy, they also view that as not their purview, but it is something they have to respond to. So they can't affect the stimulus directly. They can't lobby Congress or do anything like that. But I think they are keeping rates maybe higher than they would otherwise because they know that that fiscal stimulus is still there and came first from COVID and now from more of the infrastructure related spending that they're doing.
All right, just one last comment maybe from you. What has been the reaction by the market to this inflation report?
So far, I'm just looking at my screen now. Basically, not much reaction. Bond yields are roughly unchanged from where they were yesterday. The dollar is a little changed. There was some spike initially on the news, as there often is, but now stock prices are, up slightly on the S&P and down a little bit for the small caps. But basically, I think it's generally in line. The headline and core numbers were very close to what economists were expecting, and nothing about it really changes the overall view on rates or inflation. So I think the markets have kind of viewed it as a roughly in line number, nothing to respond too much, and we'll go back to focusing on other things.
Well, all right. Thank you so much today, Sam. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.